Hi, welcome. I'm Michael Lang, and this is another conversation in the series I've called In Their Voices. And today I'm going to be talking with Tim Hicks. And we'll range in our conversation, but primarily we're going to talk about a very important book that Tim's written, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Welcome, Tim.
Hello, Michael. Good to be with you.
Thank you. And would you say for the viewers, say a little bit about who you are, your background, something that will help provide context for the conversation we're going to have?
Sure. I probably won't talk about who I am because I don't really know, but but my background in conflict resolution, as we call it, goes back to '93, and I came across the field accidentally through my interest in environmental issues and climate change. And at that time, actually, it was 1990 that started. Came across this field called environmental public policy dispute resolution and had no idea what that meant, but then began to explore and found this field, if we want to call it that, or this practice, this area of human endeavor called conflict resolution, and just it very much suited me. So I began practicing in 1993 after a bunch of studying, and have been at it ever since. From 2006 to 2014, I was the first director of the graduate program in conflict resolution at the University of Oregon. And that was a great opportunity that I took because I was really interested in the path of education for people doing this work. I was aware myself that, as an example, when I first read social psychology after I'd been practicing for maybe 3 years, it opened so many doors to my understanding of what I was dealing with when I was in the organizational context. So in-group, out-group behavior became much more transparent to me than it had been before I read that material. And so the fact that many mediators were beginning to practice with 40-hour trainings was, kind of brought into relief. So that's why I took on that opportunity to explore what we could do in a 2-year graduate program to prepare people for this work. And then at the end of 2014, went back into private practice, and have been doing that since. And my practice it ranges from divorce and family stuff, which I continue to do, to workplace mediations, but I don't bill myself so much as a mediator now, but more as somebody who can help people, individuals and groups, communicate across differences, communicate when things are challenging and difficult. So I'm doing a lot of facilitation or group work. I hardly know what to call it in a way, but it's helping people link together and engage together in ways that help them solve problems and make decisions and understand each other.
Great. Yeah. I've heard because our field our profession has morphed in lots of ways. I've heard some people are using the term conflict worker because it encompasses the breadth of what you're describing in your own practice. Your practice encompasses some of that marvelous breadth that the profession has taken on.
Yeah. I think I even use that term in my book, Conflict Worker, referring to people who do this work. And it's almost beyond conflict work because it's not always about conflict. Sometimes it's just about it's pre-conflict. It's the attempt to communicate effectively when that's not happening, even when they're. In fact, I just came from a case where there wasn't a great deal of conflict, but they realized that they just weren't hearing and problem solving together. They weren't collaborating very well together. So yeah.
Well, marvelous. And speaking of your book, because it isn't just about your book, that intrigued me, and why I wanted to have this conversation with you, although that was the catalyst. Apart from knowing one another for a long period of time, I was really, um, you, you provided me with the introduction and a chapter. Actually, you posted it on mediate.com
Yep.
and then encouraged me to read it. And I was immediately taken with, with it. And I want to explain a little bit as a way of entering into the conversation that that part of what really excited me about and fascinated me about the book is your bringing together theory and practice, that you come at your work as somebody who is steeped in and fascinated with theory, ideas, concepts. But at heart, and I find myself the same way, I'm a practitioner, and so are you. And so your book talks about, in a unique and wonderful way, that nexus between the thinking and the doing, the theory and the practice. And so that's what I really want to start with our conversation about. How did you conceive of the idea for the book? What was the spark that got you excited to write about? And maybe you should just talk about, give the name of the book, and if you've got it there, hold it up so everyone can see it.
Hold on, I do have a copy.
Absolutely.
It doesn't come with the tabs in it, but
That's great. Embodied Conflict. And at the end of the video, we'll provide information for people to be able to find it if they'd like to learn more about it and hopefully purchase it.
yeah, great. It's funny, the first, the beginning of the book was preceded an article that I wrote in, I think, 2000 for Negotiation Journal, called, I think it was titled something like Another Look at Identity-Based Conflict. And that article was prompted by me waking up in the middle of the night one night and realizing what I think is pretty obvious, but to my slow learning mind was revelatory, realizing the connection between conflict and our reality formation and identity formation processes. I'd been in practice maybe 4 years at that point, and was kind of realizing that our ideas about what's real and true and our ideas about who we are were very intimately involved in conflict relations. And so I wrote that article and continued to think about it over the years, and then began to read a lot more neuroscience. And then that's what led to the book, because I wanted to try and capture the connection between our understanding of the processes of reality formation and identity formation and our experience of conflict, our response to conflict, and our experience within conflict. So that's what led to the book. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so much of that's been written about identity-based conflict focuses on group, on
Yes.
national disputes or cultural disputes, and not on how our formation as individuals leads to the way in which we interact, and the way in which we interact can at times either produce or conflict or make it more difficult to be able to resolve a dispute.
Yes, yes. The term identity conflicts was a term of trade in a way, and it referred to ethnic conflicts, that kind of thing. And I came to the belief that, or the framing that every conflict is an identity-based conflict, is an identity conflict, because conflict resolution is a change process, right? If there's no change, there's no resolution. What is it that we are changing? To some degree or another, we're changing what people believe, what they think, how they see the world, how they see themselves. We're asking them to change their mind, and uh, and that means they have to change. Well, first of all, that's a literal statement, not just a figurative statement. That it's, and we can talk more about that. But it is actually the physical body that is changing, because our consciousness experience is embedded and embodied in neural structures in the brain. So the brain has to change for people to change. Um, and so when we're asking people to change, we're asking them to change who they are to some degree or another, and recognizing that, going back to our, talking about theory and practice, recognizing the identity dimension of the relational experience that is happening before us with the parties that we're working with can help us then understand what's happening more and work with it hopefully more effectively, because we realize what is being engaged and what's being challenged.
Yeah, and I can imagine, because I know that I am, as I listen to you, um, uh, viewers are going to grab onto that idea that people have to change, and they're going to think about transformation, and they're going to think of something that is grand, dramatic, extensive. And I know from reading your work that you have a different understanding about change, and I'd like to get to that, but I think it would be really helpful to understand some of the background, because that helps explain, that helps answer the question of what do you mean by change?
Yeah. So the basic core idea, um, and these days people are talking about neuroscience everywhere. It's the new frontier, excitingly, but it's also a bit of a fad. Everybody is very excited about, and it's almost one of those things where a little learning is a dangerous thing. But and most of what's been written relating neuroscience and conflict resolution, certainly, and other disciplines as well, has to do with brain structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus, and um, brain chemistry and that kind of thing. The neuroscience that I'm talking about is very basic and non-technical, and that is the function that we know exists that encodes perceptual experience in neural structures. And I'll probably say that a few times because it can take a bit to get through, but our perceptual experience from before birth results in the establishment of neural structures that abide. Otherwise, we would not have learning, we would not have memory. So we know that's a fact, that neural structures are created. We know almost nothing about really how that works. There's more questions, many, many more questions than there are answers, but we do know that it happens. And we know this just from the evidence of learning and memory, but we also know it from the impact of brain injury, brain disease, Alzheimer's, and that kind of thing, from the impact of drugs, from surgical interventions. We know that if you mess with the physical structures of the brain, you mess with what people experience, what they know, what they believe, and who they are. So this basic function of the brain of encoding perceptual experience in neural structures that are dynamic and complex and intricate, that function and the structures that are created have certain characteristics. And if we understand those characteristics, if we take them into account, we can better understand why it is that people have so much trouble with differences, for instance, because the neural structures that I have established in me right now, I'm reticent to let go of. I'm reticent to change. Um, and there are conditions in which I'm more or less reticent. If I'm feeling under threat, which we are in conflict, I will be much less likely to be willing to change my mind. And I talk in the book about the balance between stability and plasticity. And people talk about plasticity, brain plasticity a lot these days. But in this context, it's just a balance between me being willing to listen to you and take in what you say and agree, and even just to listen to you if I'm in disagreement with you. How willing am I to hear that? Because your words entering me challenge my neural structures. And so recognizing that whole structural functional phenomenon can help us understand why it can be so difficult for people in conflict to hear each other, to appreciate and acknowledge what the other person is saying, particularly when it challenges our own worldview and our own self-identity. It also, I'll try to cut this short a bit, but the other thing that is important is that each individual comes into the mediation with their, as we were talking about before, their identity, who they are, their meaning associations. And when they are presented with a challenging point of view, they have to shift their understanding of the conflict to some degree and their role in the conflict. Partly we're asking people to take responsibility for the conflict as it's happened and their part in it and their part in the solution. To do that, they have to change their role in the narrative. And in conflict, sorry, I'm going on and on because there's so many different parts of this, but in conflict, the parties are basically saying that the other person is a bad person and they are wrong. And of course, I don't want to be told I'm wrong. And so in order to take on a new understanding of the dynamic and the relationship and the past conflict, and to change my role, I have to somehow find a way to still be a positive protagonist in that whole narrative. And as long as I'm being called bad and wrong, it's going to be hard for me to accept that. And all of this is based on, all of this experiential stuff we're talking about is based on actual physical neural structures that need to shift in one way or another, and that have a number of other characteristics that we can talk about.
Yeah, I want to do that because I think a lot of folks, the common understanding, for example, of a situation that you just described, is that people say, well, I believe X, you believe Y. I'm right, you're wrong. I've got to persuade you to my point of view, or you've got to persuade me, or we have to find a third point of view. We think about it behaviorally in terms of the interaction. We think about it behaviorally in terms of what I need to do, but we don't often think about it, and I use the word think, in the way that we have to alter our thinking in order to be able to alter our behavior, that they are interconnected. And so I want to go back a bit to the formation of these neural pathways and structures, because you and I are not neuroscientists. You know a lot more than I do, but neither of us claim expertise. We claim some knowledge. You a considerable amount, which I appreciate and want to tap into in our conversation. But I think it's important to connect, because a lot of people, I keep using this phrase, a lot of people, a common understanding, I think of memory, for example, is like a computer memory. You know, we've got a bunch of files or a filing cabinet. I have one here to my right, you know, a filing cabinet, and we take pieces of information and we file them away. And they are there in some sort of order, usually sequential in some kind of way. Um, Alphanumeric is the way in which we do it. It's by date. Um, but you're talking about the formation of memory and the process of learning in a really different way that I think is important as a foundation for what we're going to continue to talk about. So, do you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. In the womb, the fetus, as soon as there's enough hardware developed, uh, uh, um, begins to encode the perceptual experiences he or she has. For example, mother's voice in the womb. Consequently, when after birth, the child recognizes the mother's voice because that encoding had happened. And again, we don't understand much about those wired knowledges, but everything that we deal with in conflict resolution and in conflict are, as you were listing them, you know, our beliefs, what we think about, what we think we know, what we believe is true, all of those are based on past experience of the individual that has been encoded, has been mapped into their the wiring of their brain, so to speak. But as you were suggesting, it's not fixed like a computer. It's very dynamic and it is open to change. Um, so, I mean, that's the basic, the kind of the basic process that we're talking about, and that fact of experience means that we can understand thinking and believing in different ways and understand the nature of communication in different ways. So let me just talk a little bit about communication and what's actually happening. And we don't usually think about it in these terms, but um, first of all, you know, we have to learn our language. So the infant, the child, learns word sounds, nonsense syllables, and those are encoded in structures, and they are associated with perceptual experience. So I hear the word lamp, that sound means nothing. I also see what is pointed to when I'm a 2 and 3 year old, and it's these things, and I link those two things and I develop language ability, and that progresses. And now you and I have this huge storehouse of language library. When I speak, the words that transfer from my body to your body carry no meaning. They're just nonsense syllables. They enter into your body and they activate within you the neural structures associated with those sounds. And what is activated in you has various meaning associations based on your past experience, which may be close to my past experience, like we both experienced lamps in the English language, but also might be quite distant from my experience. I won't know whether the associations I have with those word sounds are similar, close enough to the associations you have, unless we talk about it. I assume that the word sounds are activating in you what is activated in me, but I might be wrong. And you assume that what gets activated in you is what I meant, but that may not be true as well. So understanding that the physical basis of what's actually happening in communication underscores what we have to do as mediators in helping people communicate more effectively.
Yeah,
It
because
also,
Yeah,
Yeah,
what would,
one last thing.
oh,
It
please.
also it also underscores the vulnerability of communication, the intimacy of communication, and the potential for violence. We can understand those things uh, by recognizing what's actually happening on the physical level. And we might even be able to help parties recognize the intimacy and vulnerability and potential for violence by maybe explaining what's actually happening in communication. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me is not the case. Words can really hurt. Yeah. And that's why we can understand why people get so defensive in conflict, to shut out those words that are threatening to change us in ways that we're not willing to change, and that can characterize us in ways that we are not willing to be characterized.
You know, you and I could use, and this is a common experience that people in our profession have, that that when people engage in trying to resolve a dispute of some kind, what often arises is that one or both of them will say, "That's not fair."
Or that's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
And what we know on a behavioral level is that what I establish as fair has to do with my life experience, my sense of what I learned, what I read about, my sense of what's just and honorable and appropriate. What you're talking about is it's not just those experiences that we have had, it is the effect that those experiences have on our brain structure, right? It's the way in which we incorporate those experiences that constitutes our reaction when we hear the word fair. Just as you said, if we both hear the word lamp, um, it's going to be very different for each of us.
Mm-hmm. But common enough for us to understand. Whereas fair, we might not, fair means something to you and makes sense within your structure. Um, and fair means something to me that's real, but sometimes they're so different. We think they're the same because we're using the same words. That's why, just jumping ahead a little bit to the application of theory to practice, one of the changes that I've made in my practice since thinking in this way is we're often very proud of, as mediators, to get all the issues down on the whiteboard. Yeah, what are the issues? And we write them down, or we list them on our pad or whatever, and we think we've done that step, and then we go on. But I've realized that we need to, I think, spend more time unpacking what those issues mean to the parties. We can make the mistake of saying, having one party saying, "Oh, this is it's issue whatever," and not only will I think that they're talking about the same thing, but the danger is that I'll assume that my associations with those words are the same as theirs. So I spend a lot more time on issues, not listing them, but unpacking them. What does this issue really mean for you before we go on? Yeah.
Because yeah, I'm thinking about that as because you're not talking about interest versus position. This is something that's more fundamental and more profound than just merely saying, well, that's your position, but what's the underlying interest that goes along with that? You're talking about something that is so ingrained within us that issue actually that those pathways that have been developed out of our experiences are what caused me to say that issue is even important, much less how and why it's important to me.
Yeah. 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 And it's not as if this kind of understanding of the dynamics of communication and relationship um, means that we can, we're not surgeons. We can't go in and manipulate stuff. But my own belief is that, and the reason that I wrote the book was that I think that just recognizing that fundamental physical reality of our consciousness experience can shed light on some of the things that we know already in conflict resolution about the challenges of understanding and the resistance to change and impasse and those kinds of things. It can kind of shed light on the experience that the parties are having and maybe the experience that we're having as the mediator, so then we can work more consciously with the material.
So it's interesting because, so many mediation courses, especially basic mediation training courses, include segments about communication techniques, ways in which we can facilitate or encourage better communication. And that one of the techniques that mediators are trained to use is summarizing. So, and the worst phrase, of course, is, let me see if I can say what you're saying, or let me hear this is what I hear you saying. And what you would be saying is that no matter how respectfully that's done, it isn't just what I hear you saying, it is what you mean by what you're saying that we need to concentrate on.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, Tim, this is an example of trying to find a common understanding of language between us. You wrote a book, I've read your book, we both are, experienced professionals. But when I think about the neural pathways, for example, I think about it, for example, like a spider's web of all of these. And I wonder if that's a useful metaphor.
Very much so. And when you read neuroscientists, they use all kinds of terms: webs, nets, structures. There's a whole list of them. I use them in the book, just sprinkle them through just to illustrate that we're using these metaphors to try and capture what's actually happening at the physical level. Web is a good one because the brain is massively interconnected, and there's a number of implications of that. One is, for instance, that thinking that divorcing logic and reason from emotion and feeling is false and inaccurate. Emotion and feeling are always tied in intimately with our cognitive, logical thinking, and the conflict resolution practice can tend to be intellectual and very thought-based and rational and logical, and let's work through these things. But to ignore the emotion and not deal with the emotion is to miss a whole piece that is there unavoidably. But another reason that the web metaphor is good is that meaning is all based on association. So, the meaning of a word is the association between the sound and the object. And that's true in much more, subtle and complex ways. And the associations, you can almost think of it as a core idea or a word or a thought has its central meaning and most prominent meaning for an individual, but there can be cascading reverberations out to other things. That's why, for instance, PTSD happens, because one of the consequences of this whole neural reality of neural structures is that understanding another is based on the activation of one's internal structures. And what gets activated can be something quite precise, or something quite extensive. And so we can get kind of people, when we talk about people getting triggered, it's because these associations are spreading out in the web. And in a mediation, it's helpful to pay attention to what is getting activated, that the parties may not be aware of at first or may not be able to speak about it first, but those activations are affecting how they're talking about the subject at hand.
Sure. Without trying to get too silly about the web idea, it's the difference between a mosquito hitting the web and a bird.
Yeah, exactly.
They're going to have very, very different reverberations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to recognize that it's a physical event for people. I think that that it's a body. That's why, I use the term embodied conflict, that people are present in their body, in their whole body, and they feel things in their body. And we're not tangibly aware of the physical aspect within our skull, but it is there nonetheless. And so to recognize, again, some of the dynamics of that can help us understand what's going on more and consider what's needed, what the parties need, given those facts.
So two things. I eventually want to get into the implications of this for training and practice. It's just so fascinating. But one of the things that you began to talk about, and we said that we'd come back to, is the difficulty of change. And I think if the metaphor of the web makes sense in some respect, I mean, it is helpful and imperfect at the same time.
Metaphors are always limited.
That's right.
Yeah.
That if you take an existing web that has been carefully constructed and you want to change even one part of it, there's going to be tremendous resistance, because it's not just changing that one part, it has impacts throughout the web.
Yes.
At the margins, perhaps very limited, and immediately adjacent to the event or the piece that's being changed, very profound and significant.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's great to kind of play with the different ways that we can use the metaphors, because as you say, in some ways the web metaphor doesn't work in that, I don't know what another metaphor would be that would address that stability, plasticity, balance in a different way. But yeah, it's very important to consider what might get rent by a particular settlement proposal, and what implications to other parts of the web might exist. And one of the changes, again, talking about the implications for practice, is how I think about impasse, related to what you were saying, because I now feel much more comfortable with impasse than I ever did before, because it's a sign, first of all, that somehow the proposed possible solutions are not fitting into the worldview, not fitting into the structure. And then that helps us then think, well, okay, what needs to shift in order to make it fit? But also, what are there concerns that the party has? Are there implications for their other relationships or their place in the world? Particularly identity-based issues that need to be addressed, that are getting in the way. So yeah, the metaphor works very well that way. And as you say, sometimes it's a very big effect, and sometimes it's a very subtle effect, and sometimes the effects are insignificant and we don't need to deal with them. But sometimes they're very significant, and we need to find out what those are.
Yeah, because this is so interesting. A common view in our profession is that when you when parties reach an impasse, what you do is you tweak the proposal. Well, if that doesn't work, then how about this? And could you shift and could you that? And your approach, based on the principles that you write about, is very different. It's both requires an acceptance of that ambiguity as being important, not as a problem, not as a threat to you, to your success, or to the party's success.
Yeah. Yeah, it's information, very much information that then you can start to mine.
Yeah, because it opens up, you're talking about neural pathways and so on, but it opens up many, many pathways for us as mediators to explore with parties, that can help them either adjust to, or modify in their own way the solutions.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I found that this whole way of thinking about things, again, it's not as if it creates a specific tool that you can then go in and do something with, but it it I used the same term before, it sheds some light on, or it gives another perspective on what's happening that then can help us think about our practice and our interventions and our role in a slightly different way, and hopefully a more helpful way.
Because it doesn't involve different skills.
No, it's the
No,
same.
it
It's the same.
involves different thinking
Yeah, yeah,
in order to use the skills in a different way.
yeah, yeah. For instance, you mentioned positions and interests earlier, and understandably, the practice of trying to move people off their positions to interest makes lots of sense in lots of ways. But it's another place where my practice has changed a bit, because positions are safe and comfortable and sustain the reality construct and worldview that the position holder has. To ask them to move off their position cavalierly and too soon can recreate lots of problems in the conflict resolution process. It's okay for them to hold on to their position for maybe a lot longer than we typically think is okay, and that we typically train young mediators to expect. Um, and then what is needed for them to feel safe enough to move into the uncertainty of interest-based negotiating. And the whole balance of certainty and uncertainty is part of what's happening. People come in needing to be very certain about that they are right and the other person is wrong. For them to let go of right, they need to have another stone to step on. They can't leave that stone yet. And so asking them to jump into the water of interests is sometimes not helpful.
What's fascinating for me right now is one of the beliefs I have about the work we do is that it's very important, even though the notion is that we're supposed to help parties achieve convergence, a coming together, that paradoxically, one of the ways in which we can best do that is by supporting them becoming divergent, intensifying really their appreciation, their appreciation on their own behalf and and to the other person, of just how differently they see, experience, and want to resolve their differences.
Yeah.
And what you just described is a way of understanding why that belief system, why that theory makes sense.
Yeah.
And as human, in terms of the structures that we have and the way we think.
Yeah. Yeah. Another angle on just exactly what you were saying is the question of party storytelling. You know, how much in some trainings or some indicators, it said conflict resolution is about the future. Don't let the parties talk too much about the past, because they're going to get all wrapped up and reinforce that conflict. And my belief is that the parties need to feel experienced, known, and acknowledged in the room for who they are and for what they believe and what they know. You have to start there. And until they feel that they are being acknowledged and respected and heard and known, until that happens, they're going to be less willing, again, to change. And so I'm doing much more of the party storytelling, but I'm trying to help them do it in a way that isn't contradicting the other or characterizing the other or negating the other, but rather helping them realize that they can both exist, if it's two parties, two people, concurrently with their differences, and that before we can go anywhere, we have to see what those differences are. It's like, let's put the pieces on the table so that we can then fit them together.
You know, Tim, I think it was Sarah Cobb who did some research and wrote a paper, and maybe it was co-authored, but it's a bit fuzzy to me now because it was in the early 90s. So it was a while ago. But what the research discovered is that when you do storytelling in that part of a process, that what occurs is that the second person tells their story in relation to what the first person has said.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so what you've just described connects clearly with that research to say, we have to find a way as practitioners to help each person say their story in their time, in their words, with their emotion or lack of it as they choose.
Yep. Yep. And it's so hard yes, exactly, that we have to help them do that independently of each other. And it's so hard, as we know, we say to parties, please listen, try not to interrupt if you've got quite right notes, all of this stuff, to appreciate how hard it is to hear, which means to have parts of your brain activated, a reality that is counter to your own. We can just appreciate that difficulty more, particularly in cases of threat. We're much less willing, obviously. And even with our dear spouses, we get into conflicts of identity where we just don't want to hear what their experience is because we're relating it to our own experience. We're getting all activated rather than being able to really hear what their experience is without us having to respond. And yeah.
Oh, I mean, why don't I like olives? My wife loves olives. I mean, at a most silly level, that's it. That's, because of whatever was my experience, what I grew up, learning about, tasting, whatever.
Yeah.
And what she did. But
yeah,
that's just a silly example that occurred to me.
Yeah, I think helping, one of the questions that I ask in the book is, what role and to what degree what role does educating the parties play, and to what degree can we take time to share with the parties theoretical concepts that might help them in conflict resolution? And I play with that a little bit in my practice these days of introducing these neural concepts in terms I hope that can work for the particular setting. But it's a way to help them appreciate differences. All of the biases that we're concerned about impacting negatively conflicts over differences, the implicit bias, confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, naive realism, stereotyping, projection, all of these biases can be clearly understood on the basis of this neural understanding that, that we all have implicit biases all the time. Implicit bias is just the bias that has been structurally established in our brain based on our experience. And confirmation bias is just confirmation bias is an indicator that the information that's being presented requires a greater change in the person's neural structures than they can tolerate at that moment. And so they reject it, yeah, because for whatever reason, they cannot tolerate that much change that the data is, or the information is suggesting. So, we are subject to these biases. Understanding them helps us manage them. And understanding them comes down to really understanding what biases are in neural terms.
And do you find when you talk with your clients in this way that they are patient, open, even eager to learn about these things?
It varies. And some, whoops, sorry. In some cases, I won't even try. But when I feel that the parties could be receptive, have the right kind of, I don't know what to call it, but where I think there may be an opportunity for me to do that, I'll get some quizzical looks, and then I'll quickly go on and not spend too much time on it. But in other cases, parties will say, wow, yeah. And then they will come back to that and tie and relate their experience later in the process to those ideas that I've introduced. So it can work, it can help. We know that mediators, at least I'm often doing some kind of education or another. Mm-hmm. The one that I use probably 98% of the time, maybe not quite that much, whether it's in an organizational setting or with individuals, is Maura Duggan's nested theory, which when she first presented that to me in Yellow Springs, it opened doors for me. Mm-hmm. And now in a divorce mediation, I'll draw that up on a board, I'll put it on a pad and show them. In workplaces, I'll do it because it's a theoretical construct that helps people understand what's going on with their experience, why they're feeling so stressed and in conflict, and why they're having trouble resolving the conflict. So we use these tools of education, and presumably we have benefited, have benefited from the learnings that I've gotten from my reading in the field and from trainings that I've taken. If it's helped me, then don't I want to pass that on to the parties? But we face limitations, of course, limitations of time, money, expectations. Some contexts it's not suitable at all, some it is much more. In the environmental public policy realm, it's typical that you have one phase just for education, mm-hmm. sometimes on the substantive, technical, scientific issues, but also on interest-based negotiation. And I'd love to, in those contexts, spend an hour with the parties just on the neural stuff and how difficult it is to receive into you opposing points of view. So yeah.
Yeah, one of you're mentioning Maura and the experience at Antioch. One of the other pieces that occurs to me, and I do agree with you about her nested theory. It's a very it has the benefit of being simple and accurate and profound all at the same time.
Yep.
That one of our guest speakers, you may remember Wally Warfield, would come, and he talked about sometimes that it's important when you're doing interventions, particularly with groups, that sometimes you have to spend time with one faction, helping them understand how to dispute, how to be good conflict engagers, how to express what matters greatly to them, um, and to do it in a way that's authentic, but
Yeah.
nevertheless that's, yeah.
Yeah.
So that preparatory work, yeah.
Yeah, to be a negotiating coach, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, Tim, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I want to see if there's something that you wish that I had asked you, or something more that you would like to say before we conclude what could, given all the things that I'm thinking about in response to what you've been saying, this could only be, the first of several of these conversations. And whether we record them or not, I'm praying and hoping that there will be many more. But is there something more that you would like to add um, uh, right now?
yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is that I find it quite a challenge to present the ideas because there's a lot of them that all relate and interrelate. So it's an interesting, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about it. Um, I think one thing that comes up for me is, and this is really to say the obvious, uh, but again, I think that recognizing the reality of our consciousness experience, our experience as human beings, recognizing some of the physical bases of that, means that we can appreciate the humanity of the people who come into our office or who we are, privileged to work with. And we can appreciate through our own self-reflection about our experience in conflict and recognizing the feelings we have in response to differences, in response to disagreement, um, and recognizing the physical basis of that gives us more compassion and empathy for the people we're working with. And I say, when I'm doing trainings, or when I'm talking about the book, I'll say to the audience, when you agree with me, I like you more. And it always gets that response of nods
Right.
and smiles because we know that we like it when people agree with us. Why is that so? It's because it confirms our own identity. It confirms our reality structures. The words of agreement, or the words that concur with our own beliefs, reinforce what we know and therefore reinforce who we are. And that feels good. And when you disagree with me, you challenge my neural structure, my understanding of the world and myself. And I don't like that. I don't want you to challenge me. And I'm more willing to have you challenge me if I trust you and if I'm not threatened by you. Um, and trust and threat are very much involved in conflict. So all of these things, this framework of understanding our communication and relational experience can help us be more empathic and maybe more competent as practitioners because we recognize what's actually going on for the parties. It's not some ephemeral, why are they being that way? It's physically based, and we can appreciate that and then maybe work with it more effectively.
And let's make an important, I hate to even interrupt because that was such an exquisite um, piece that you just did, but connecting to this notion about our ability to see the humanity in the people we're working with. That when you talk about empathy, you're not, I don't think that you're necessarily referring to compassion, which is different. That we don't have to be, touchy feely kind of people that might not be in our nature, it might not be in our neural structures to, our learned experience to be that way. Or we might not believe that that's part of our role, even if we are capable of that. But when you talk about empathy, you're talking about the acknowledgement of the humanity of everyone in the room, ourselves included.
Yeah, yeah. And I would include compassion both, because when we understand why it is that somebody is reacting so defensively, if we understand that they are having a physical experience and that their structure is being threatened, their identity structure is being threatened, then we can have more compassion for that. And with more compassion, we can have more patience. And also with more understanding, we can have more competence, maybe. So it's both the empathy and the compassion. Yeah. Yeah.
Tim, this has been and beyond enjoyable, but exciting, and it's just a great time to be able to talk to you. Thank you, really. Thanks. And thanks for talking about these ideas, because I think your way of explaining helps us as practitioners recognize that the science that you describe has a direct bearing on and implications for the work that we do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and let me say, I love having opportunities to kind of noodle with this stuff and to talk with practitioners, and particularly with students, but with anybody interested in human relationship. So to those people who are listening perhaps now, if they want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to engage and talk with them. And I love presenting to students, but in other settings as well, more in terms of engaging in conversation as we are, presenting a few ideas and then letting people noodle with it. So I encourage people to get in touch with me if they want. I don't know how we get. I don't know if you include any material, but you can include my email address, certainly.
I will include something at the end, Tim, with that information and an invitation as well to get in touch with you, as well as information about how people can read about and purchase your book.
I will actually email you. Well, it's at the bottom of my emails. There's a discount code that people can get, I think, a 30% discount on the book.
Oh, nice.
From Rutledge. Yeah, so that code is embedded in my signature, so you could share that with them.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Tim, thanks again.
A pleasure, Michael, really.